Chapter 6. Robert E. Lee in Northern Virginia. The Peninsula and Second Bull Run. Northern Virginia, June 1st, August 30th through August 30th, 1862. It was not war, it was murder. A quote from General D. H. Hill, Confederate Army. On May 31st, 1862, overall Confederate Commander Joseph E. Johnston led his army into the rain-soaked, knee-deep mud outside the Fair Oaks train depot in a final attempt to keep the surging Union Army from surrounding Richmond, laying siege to the city and ending the war with one humiliating Confederate defeat. Johnston, seeing what he thought was a weakness in the Federal positions, issued a bunch of confusing orders, handwritten on scraps of paper, and ordered his units to march into a thick forest where they immediately got lost, ran into one another, attacked the wrong place, and then got ingloriously mowed down by the Union artillery. When Johnston rode up to the front lines to try to see what the heck was going on, he was shot in the shoulder by a sniper, got hit in the chest with artillery shrapnel, and fell off his horse, breaking his shoulder blade and a couple of ribs and knocking himself unconscious in the process. It was not the Confederacy's finest hour. The situation following the disaster at Fair Oaks could not have been worse for the South. In the days following the Virginia's unsuccessful attempt to break the Union blockade, overall Union Commander George B. McClellan landed 130,000 Federal soldiers, 14,000 horses, and 300 cannons at the tip of the Yorktown Peninsula, marched them within 6 miles of Richmond, and now had the Confederate capital city almost completely surrounded. McClellan's troops were camped so close they could hear the Richmond church bells go off on Sunday morning. If that wasn't enough, there was also a second, equally massive force of Union soldiers garrisoning Washington, D.C., just 90 miles northeast of Richmond. The Confederacy was about to be crushed by two incomprehensibly gigantor military forces bent on its destruction. Opposing this onslaught was a ragtag band of 50,000 demoralized Confederate troops who had just watched their commander beef it off a horse and knock himself out. They were poorly equipped, hungry, exhausted, and outnumbered 3-1 by a well-supplied force of hardened troops packing top-of-the-line gear, an unquenchable thirst for rebel blood, and the motive, means, and opportunity to spill plenty of it. What happened next is the reason why Joseph E. Johnston's replacement, General Robert E. Lee, is now regarded as one of the most brilliant military commanders ever produced on American soil. The son of former Virginia governor and famous Revolutionary War cavalry commander Harry Lighthorse Lee, Robert Edward Lee was a 30-year-old veteran of the United States military who was so famous for his tactical brilliance that when the Civil War initially began, Abraham Lincoln had personally offered to make Lee the overall commander of all U.S. military forces. Lee, a native son of Virginia, politely declined. Even though he opposed the war, he couldn't lead an army against his fellow Virginians, so he accepted a staff officer position in Richmond. Now, suddenly he found himself in command of the entire rebel army on the Eastern Front. Lee sprang into action immediately, devising a bold attack plan that nobody saw coming. Lee knew that his opponent, George McClellan, was a really cautious guy, so he tried to take advantage of that fact. Rather than turtling up and trying to defend the city, Lee took a small number of troops, had them dig trenches in front of Richmond, and then left them there to stare across a battlefield at 5 full-strength corps of Union infantry, even though such a small force had no chances of survival if the Union attacked. Then he took the main part of his army, crossed the rain-flooded Chickahominy River, and threw the full might of his soldiers at the extreme right flank of the Federal position, Meanwhile, he also sent his A1 toughest and most daring cavalry commander, Jeb Stuart, all the way around the Union flank to attack their supply and communications depots from the rear. According to Stuart, a swashbuckling cavalryman who wore a cape and an ostrich plume in his hat and carried a 9-shooter revolver with an under-barrel attachment that fired a 10-gauge shotgun charge of buckshot. The only time his Virginia cavalry stopped during their 150-mile ride was to receive kisses from the local women. He lost one man, got much-needed intel for Lee, cut off the Federals, and made the front page of every newspaper in the South. Given the strategic situation, you can probably guess that on the morning of June 26, 1862, the Union soldiers of General Fitz John Porter's Federal Fifth Corps really weren't expecting to see tens of thousands of gunslinging Confederate troops come charging out through the rain and mud. Porter's troops put up a good fight, but before long their lines began to buckle. McClellan, already hesitant to begin with, lost his nerve, completely panicked, and ordered a retreat. Then, over the next 7 days of nonstop warfare, Robert E. Lee led the Army of Northern Virginia in 8 separate battles, repeatedly pounding the Union where they least expected it. Lee's troops paid dearly for every inch of ground they took, suffering almost 20,000 casualties in the course of just one calendar week. But amazingly, they managed to send the entire Union Army reeling. When McClellan tried to move some of his 80,000 troops up to help Porter's battered corps, Lee ordered the small group of men defending Richmond to charge, not as a stupid suicide attack, but as a diversion to keep McClellan guessing about what was going on. Scrambling up muddy hills into Union artillery and firing lines, the Army of Northern Virginia fought, scrapped, and clawed its way back from almost certain destruction. By the end of the 7 days' battle, the Union was in full retreat. But Robert E. Lee wasn't out of the woods just yet. As you could probably guess, President Lincoln wasn't all that thrilled that George B. McClellan was currently running for his boats, so he took the fresh, pumped-up troops he had back home in Washington, put them under the command of a guy named John Pope, and sent them to threaten Richmond while Lee was off chasing McClellan around the peninsula. Lee had to act fast. By this point, he was in command of about 80,000 men in and around Richmond, and they were sandwiched between the 90,000 men McClellan had camped at Yorktown, southeast of Richmond, and the 62,000 other dudes that Pope had marching down from the north. If those two forces linked up, it was all over. If he committed his entire army to attacking either of them, he left Richmond unguarded. So, once again, Lee did something that would give most military tacticians an aneurysm. He attacked. Robert E. Lee divided his army in the face of his enemy, one of the top 3 things you're never supposed to do when you're a military commander, and sent just 23,000 soldiers under the now famous Stonewall Jackson, remember him, north to deal with Pope. Despite knowing that they were marching into a hopeless situation, on August 24th, 1862, Jackson's men slogged a grueling 54 miles in just 2 days. This was an insane achievement, considering that every man was wearing about 50 pounds of gear and carrying a 10-pound rifle, and most of them were walking barefoot, because the Confederacy didn't have enough shoes to go around. They then somehow snuck behind Pope's army and attacked the Union supply depot at Alexandria. Pope, freaking out that the enemy was suddenly behind him, turned around and charged, but Jackson fell back into the woods before Pope could get to him. Pope, a shameless self-promoter whose primary job before the Civil War involved supervising the construction of lighthouses on the Great Lakes, continued running around aimlessly looking for Jackson. As he was doing that, Jeb Stuart's cavalry rode around behind Pope and from the other side. attacked a couple more depots and ransacked Pope's personal supply tent, stealing $35,000 in cash, Pope's military dress uniform, a notebook containing complete troop dispositions for the entire battlefront. Pope, now pantless, broke, and humiliated, didn't even notice when Robert E. Lee sent another big chunk of his army north to hit the Union force where they were off searching for Jackson. This left Lee just a few men to defend Richmond in case McClellan's 90,000 troops attacked, but he didn't seem to mind. Pope finally found Jackson on August 28th. Stonewall had set up his forces around Manassas Junction, the same place where he'd earned his famous nickname. And when Pope came out of the woods, Jackson was ready for him. Pope's men launched a series of vicious assaults on Jackson's lines, the Union commander hurling waves and waves of his men at the Confederates. Stonewall's men held, however, fighting for almost 7 hours, their ammunition so low that at one point Wheat's Tigers had to resort to throwing rocks at the enemy as they advanced. They stood their ground, however, the Union bravely charging at them with everything they had, but before long it looked like the battle would end in a draw. The South held. The Union was exhausted, and it seemed the battle was over. It was at this point that 30,000 fresh Confederate troops came marching out of the woods, behind Pope's army. I'll spare you the gory details. Let's just say it didn't end well for Pope. His army was pulverized, and he was fired and exiled to Minnesota, never to be heard from again. McClellan loaded his troop into ships, left the peninsula the next day, and was fired as soon as he got back to Washington. It was time for the Army of the Potomac to regroup and reassess the situation. It had been just 90 days since Robert E. Lee had taken over. He'd walked into disaster. Now his Army of the Northern Virginia was the only military unit left standing within 50 miles of the Confederate capital. A quote from Private William Lusk, the U.S. Army. Gone were the proud hopes, the high aspirations that swelled our bosoms a few days ago. The Army has strong limbs to march and meet the foe, stout arms to strike heavy blows, brave hearts to dare. But the brains, the brains. Have we no brains to use the arms and limbs and eager hearts with cunning? A note about sharpshooters. Organized, recruited, and trained by New Yorker Hiram Burden, a mechanical engineer and recreational sports shooter who won the National Rifleman Competition an amazing 15 years in a row. Burden's sharpshooters were an elite regiment who hold the distinction of being among the first sniper units in history. Dressed in their distinctive all-green uniform, this elite Union regiment of eagle-eyed marksmen was used as scouts, skirmishers, and rear guard troops, but was also heavily engaged as frontline troops against Confederate forces at battles from the 7 Days to Gettysburg. They served with Fitz John Porter's Corps at Second Bull Run. You see here the reference of the Second Battle of Bull Run, the Second Manassas. The number of troops, the Union had 70,000 troops with them. The Confederates only had 55,000. Casualties taken. The Union lost 13,824 souls, while the Confederates lost 8,353 souls. The result of this battle is considered a Confederate victory. Camp life. Soldiering is 99% boredom and 1% sheer terror. That's an anonymous private, Army of the Potomac. Apparently, he was either bored or scared out of his mind. Whether you were garrisoning a town, manning a fort, or just hunkering down for the winter months, the day-to-day life of a Civil War soldier wasn't exactly made up of fiery explosions, high-speed chases, and nonstop bullet-riddled excitement. In fact, anytime the troops weren't actively fighting for their lives or marching towards a battlefield, life was pretty much the most mind-numbingly boring thing this side of a middle school social studies lecture. A typical day in the life of a Civil War soldier might look like something like this. They'd be blasted awake by early rising bugle players honking out I don't know, super loudly at dawn. Who woke up the rooster like bugle players is a mystery. Then crawl out of their bedrolls and get into their uniforms. Everyone would fall in with their regiments for roll call. Then sometimes march to colors, a ceremony where a team of sergeants would raise the flag over the camp and commanding officers would bark out orders for the day. From there, soldiers would head back to their campfires for breakfast, usually consisting of coffee, bread, peanuts, and cornmeal. Although a lot of Confederate units couldn't scavenge actual coffee beans, so they'd make some almost certainly disgusting homemade coffee like slurry using peas and peanuts and God knows what else. After breakfast, troops would fall back into line for drill, which is kind of like the war version of after school football practice. Soldiers and officers would march all around the campground, working on their unit cohesion, spend time practicing their bayoneting skills on human shaped burlap sacks stuffed with straw, or head to the firing range with their rifles. Drill was a much more important part of a soldier's life in the early days of the war, sometimes going from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. with just one lunch break in between. But toward the end of the war, when almost everyone was a stone cold, steely eyed veteran, the time they needed for drill became less and less. After drill, troops were pretty much free to do their own thing. Some guys would pull guard duty or be ordered to gather firewood, food, and clean water to keep the camp running. If they were lucky enough to avoid that, they could spend their evenings writing letters to their families, attending prayer services at the chaplain's tent, or taking a fishing pole down to the creek. If they were near a town, they were free to head in and see what was going on. Even if they were camped out in a field in the middle of nowhere, there were guys called sutlers who would follow the army around with a wagon full of useful stuff like tobacco, socks, and whiskey that troops could buy with their hard-earned cash. Soldiers loved to spend their nights hanging out around the campfire and playing music, singing, telling war stories, or trying their hands at games like dominoes, chess, or checkers. Gambling was illegal in most camps, but that didn't stop guys from betting on card games such as poker or 7-Up, or dice games with names like Craps and Chuck-a-Luck. Likewise, it was illegal to get drunk and get into fights, but that didn't keep the guys of the 44th Infantry from hitting the moonshine a little too hard and ending up in fistfights with those jerks from the 7th Artillery. It sounds a lot like a college party. That's the end of Chapter 6. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're having a nice evening. Take care.